Now there's all kinds of different people in this world. There's only one pie.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Team Made Apart podcast, the podcast designed to teach those who work remotely and those who hire them how to work better together. I'm your host, Ryan Rogar. Before we get started, as always, today's show is brought to you by teammadeapart.com. Team Made Apart features articles, tools, and resources designed to teach remote workers and those who hire them how to work better together. A community for owners, managers, leaders, freelancers, contractors, and all variety of remote worker, Team Made Apart is also a terrific resource for companies interested in implementing remote work policies in otherwise co-located environments, or for those planning to build fully distributed organizations from the jump. Listeners of this podcast have an exciting opportunity to get involved in the remote work revolution. In light of current events related to the coronavirus pandemic and a sudden worldwide shift to remote work, we're offering a free remote work best practices guide for leaders who find themselves struggling to create a remote work policy in a pinch. Now, and for the duration of the crisis, visit teammadeapart.com/crisis to not only download your free Team Made Apart Remote Policy Primer, how to write remote work policies that don't suck, but to find other tools and resources to help you weather the storm. Great working relationships make for great remote work experiences, and with this free guide, you'll be better equipped to do your part in creating and maintaining a happy and sustainable remote life. Once again, to take advantage of this collection of useful resources, please visit teammadeapart.com/crisis, that is teammadeapart.com/crisis, to download your free best practices guide. One more thing before we kick off the show. Now, and for the foreseeable future, teammadeapart.com is offering free support and advice to remote workers and remote leaders alike through Team Made Apart Open Office. From noon to 2 p.m. Mountain Time, Monday through Friday, you can visit teammadeapart.com and navigate to the bottom left-hand corner of the page where you'll find a chat icon. Simply click it and you'll be connected to a real, remote work expert who is happy to help you solve problems in real time at no charge to you. Of course, you can use the same tool 24/7, 365 to ask questions or request services, but during open office hours, you've got a direct line of communication to people who care and people who can help. Once again, from noon to 2 p.m. Mountain Time, Monday through Friday, simply navigate to teammadeapart.com, find our chat icon in the bottom left-hand corner of the page, then click for instant support when you need it at no cost to you. Take advantage of this special program while it lasts, and now, back to the show. Today's special guest is Theresa Sigillito Hollema. Theresa is an experienced facilitator and consultant who supports individuals and teams in developing the competencies to collaborate and succeed with colleagues and stakeholders across the globe. With a focus on leadership and organizational capacity in 3 primary areas, building cultural competence, developing high-performance teams, and leading virtually across time and space, she helps teams make improvements which result in creative solutions, increased collaboration, improved leadership capabilities, and more effective organizations. In addition to her consultative efforts, Theresa is also the author of Virtual Teams Across Cultures, Create Successful Teams Around the World, the new book coming in July 2020. Here to discuss overcoming cultural differences across globally distributed teams and so much more, join me in welcoming our guest, Theresa Sigillito Hollema. Hey, Theresa, how are you?
Hey, Ryan. Good to see you. Thanks for inviting me here.
Absolutely. I'm so grateful to have you here on the show. I recently have read some of the work that you've been working on, and I'm so excited by your subject matter and all the work that you're doing. I'm really excited to get into this. But maybe before we start down that road, let's talk a little bit about who you are, where you come from, and where you fit in the sort of the remote work world.
Certainly. Thanks. So I have a business background. I have an MBA, and I came to Europe about 20 years ago. So right now I live in the Netherlands. I'm an American by background, but living in the Netherlands. Came over to Europe. I was working on business projects. And for me, what was really interesting was the cultural dynamics. So about 12 years ago, I became a cultural consultant, sort of pursued my passion. That was very interesting, really liked it. But I thought you can only go so far with teams. So thereafter, I became a team coach. And then about 7 years ago, my clients were saying things like, we want to understand what it's like to work virtually. So I started pursuing that as a topic as well. So if I bring all 3 of those together, I support global virtual teams and also leadership and becoming part of that team as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's really great. And I mean, now more than ever, especially as technology is permitting more and more connectivity across the planet and everything, I think, remote work is starting to come into, I don't know, I sort of describe it as the crux, sort of the middle of the two lines are crossing, and we're sort of getting into this sweet spot of remote work, where we've got technology and cultural understanding and things like that. But to that end, will you sort of describe what culture is? I think that this is one of these terms that gets bandied about a lot. And I know that for a lot of people, I hear it miscommunicated a lot, where people confuse a sweet ping pong table for culture. And I think it would be great if people understood just basically at a core level what culture is.
Okay, well, good. Thanks for that question. I'm going to take a step back and answer your sweet spot. I think that's really interesting as well. Things are coming together. Because what I notice is that a lot of people are speaking about remote work and working virtually and writing some really good work. And a lot of people are speaking around culture and understanding cultural diversity and writing some really good work. And so my sweet spot is bringing both of those together. And you're right, the technology allows that to happen. But I think understanding what really happens to us when we're working from a distance and we're working with people who are culturally diverse is an area that I spend my time. So you asked, what is culture? What is culture? And there are many different many definitions out there. I like to think of culture as the way we do things, how we give meaning, how a group of people give meaning to their lives and how they go about their lives. And part of that is, I like to reference Edward Schein at MIT. He thinks of culture like an onion, that you peel away at an onion and you get to the heart of the culture. So for instance, the things on the outside of the onion are the things that we see when we look out the window. So the architecture, the clothes, the food, the things that we often attribute to culture. But culture is actually quite deeper. And the next level, according to Schein, is this idea of norms and values, what we ought to do and what we think are right to do. And then there's even a deeper level of culture, which we call basic assumptions. And these aren't things we really talk about. This is just part of who we are, part of our groupings, how we go about and how we give meaning to things. And that's the area I find very interesting. What are the assumptions that drive our behavior when we're working with different cultures?
Well, and it makes sense, right? I mean, each of us are sort of born into our own thing, and it is really hard. I mean, we all say the words that we need to practice empathy and we need to understand other people and all these things. Like, we get all that stuff, but you almost don't realize how much is sort of born into you until you get out and you start working with other cultures and start actually seeing the differences in people. I know that was my case. I mean, as a young person born here in the United States and everything, we traveled a lot to like places throughout the United States. And sure, there are little cultural differences, little pockets in the South or little pockets, out East or in the West, in places like that have sort of their own taste or their own flavor. But the cultural differences like between humans didn't really start standing out to me until I met a lot of people from Spain. I started working with people in Spain a lot. We even took a piece of our company over there, and I now have a Spanish partner in that company. Those relationships, like, I guess I didn't understand all the nuanced difference in people, because if you just kind of work with people superficially, you don't really see it. But so how do you start, I guess as a coach or as somebody who's guiding people through this process of understanding culture, how do you begin that process? How do you start people down the road of working with an international distributed team?
So that's a good question. I think what we're trying to achieve actually are for people to develop cultural competence. And that's a lifelong journey. It's not something you just do in a course or that you do on a virtual 1-hour video or something of that sort. It's something that involves experience and analysis and speaking and learning from others as well. So I think of cultural competence in 4 areas. So it's behavior, it's mindset or attitude, it's skills, and it's mastery. So doing it over and over. And so when I'm working with a group of people, one of the areas to begin with is knowledge, understanding what does it mean to work on different from different cultures. And often I'll reference a model, but it's just a model. It's just a starting point to help us to understand that there are differences. Many people don't even realize that. They just say, oh, the others are different and that's all. But to really understand what those differences mean. And more importantly, it is what you were just saying is, how have I been influenced by my culture? How have I been influenced by spending my youth and my adult years in the US, for instance? So when I'm working with a group, first is just to understand that there are differences, but then I would like to help the group to develop the language to be able to explain their own preferences, and then to explain and to share and to try to understand others as well. So the model gets pushed aside and people learn how to speak and interact and share and understand with each other, especially in a virtual team. That can be really nice work to do.
Well, and I think, as I mentioned at the top, I've been doing a little bit of reading. You've got a book coming out in the near term. I'll let you talk about that if you feel like doing so. But one of the things that I pulled out of the little bit that I had read was this idea, and I think that this is so spot on. It's this idea of sort of our internal overconfidence. I don't know if it's an ego thing or what it is, but you mentioned in the writing or in the reading that I did that we've got this overconfidence in our ability to write in a way that the responder will understand. And I think that is so true, because I mean, even in my own life, like I spend a lot of time thinking, oh yeah, no, the way I've worded this is so crystal clear, like, you know, and I've been working remotely for a long time, so I feel really good about it. And then I will go later and talk to, you know, my Spanish counterpart or whatever, whom I've sent this note to, and find out they just didn't get it at all. And I felt like I was so on there, you know, and I think that this idea of overconfidence, I think, is really an interesting one.
So thanks for mentioning my book, because I am writing a book and I hope to have it out, let's say May this year, 2020. The approach that I had to write the book was to look in academia and see what they have that we can learn from, because academia is full of robust research, models, ideas that aren't brought out to the business community because they're not incentivized to do so. So I thought, let me see what they have that I can translate into applications for you know, clients and the business and the business community. What you're referencing is some research that was very interesting. And so it's this idea that we're overconfident in the emails that we send. Even if we think we write them very clear, the people who are reading them are misinterpreting them, at least in our mind. Also, we think that we can read someone else's email very clearly. And this is why email is such a difficult tool when we rely on that only for communication. But now you're absolutely right. Add on the cultural dynamic, when we make meaning in different ways, where we read things and have a completely different understanding, then the email becomes even more dangerous. So on virtual collaboration, email is a tool, but it cannot be the only tool for the reasons that we just said.
Well, yeah, and I think that, you know, it goes back to this idea. It's one of these just because you can doesn't mean you should sort of things, is this idea that, you know, technology has certainly made it easier for us to communicate. I mean, a tool like email makes it so that, yes, I can get an email to somebody on the other side of the planet in sort of real time. But, you know, ultimately, you know, there's so much more that goes into it than just the ease of distribution. And so I think it's really interesting to think about that stuff. You know, we spend so much time, I guess, thinking that we know what we're doing and not really thinking about these sort of cultural implications. I mean, the one example that I use is, so I speak generally, you know, pretty casual, pretty loose. I use a lot of idioms. And I found that many of those idioms don't translate in Spanish. They don't have an English equivalent. So even if like my Spanish counterpart understands the words in English, they don't understand what I'm saying. And so, you know, they are hearing the words, but they don't understand the meaning behind them. And so in my communication back and forth with our Spanish team, I will generally try and strip it of idioms as much as I can. Try and keep as much of that kind of communication out of there. And that's just like one adaptation that I've made, you know, after learning that I was poorly communicating to my team. And so, but I wonder, I mean, do you sort of agree with that idea? I mean, making these, I guess, because you don't want to make assumptions, right? So I don't want to assume what they know or what they don't know, but that's something that I've sort of learned. So I wonder how one become a better communicator?
Well, I think that's a great example, actually, is to be very careful of the words that we select or that we choose, because remember, somebody else can interpret them differently, especially if English is a second language. But I think the challenge for working virtually is that I suggest, and it's best practice for people to develop cultural competence, but we have to do it actually without going to the other countries. We have to learn how to work abroad by actually sitting in our own seats. And I think that's an interesting challenge that we have to appreciate when we're working virtually. But there's other dynamics of how culture impacts working virtually. And in my book, I mentioned 3 areas, if you recall. The first area is what we've just been talking about. So someone from Spain has different assumptions from the US. Communication is different. How we make decisions is different. How we build teams is different. And so if we don't understand that, then we're frustrated because we're expecting the others to be the same. So there's an understanding of that diversity that's in the team. So the second way that culture impacts virtual teams is how we think of people who are distant. So for instance, as humans, we think of things that are far away as more abstract. So if you think about a day in your agenda in June, maybe you kind of know what you need to do, but you don't really have a strong emotion to it. And you certainly don't know the detail. It's quite abstract. But tomorrow, you know exactly what you need to do. You know where you need to be, who you will see, how you're going to prepare, how you're going to get there. And you may even have an emotional attachment, like joy or dread, depending on what's in your agenda. And as humans, we think of people like that as well. So my colleagues that are close by in the same office, Joe was late this morning. Sue is really a nice person, and Tom did a great job on that presentation yesterday. But my colleagues in France, they are all French. So we think of them as being very abstract. And that can be a bit difficult because that doesn't help us to be close to those that are far away. We don't feel a real close connection. But on a detrimental level, it can also feed into an us versus them. So that my colleagues that are close by are part of my group, and those that are far away are them, in a very abstract level. And often that abstract level descriptors that we use are on a cultural level. They are French, and my colleagues are American or whatever, but at least they are part of me. And so that's the second way that culture can impact a virtual team. The third way is kind of interesting because if you are in an on-site meeting and you turn off and you finish the meeting, everyone is in the same location. Everyone walks out the meeting room and they smell the same air. They have the same HR policies. They're in the same tax regime. They eat at similar restaurants. But when you close a virtual meeting and everyone closes their computer, when they look out the window, they all see something different. They see some different traffic. They are experiencing a different atmosphere. The culture is different. What people think are important or how to give status to is different. The HR policies are different. The tax regime is different. And this can have an influence on virtual teams in ways that can be very unexpected and sometimes surprising. And so if you don't have cultural competence, then you will be fighting against all these influences that are outside your team. And this is why cultural competence is so important to understand, not just the others, but also, very importantly, to understand oneself.
And no, I think that's such a great topic. And this idea of us versus them, I mean, because you think, in a business relationship or among your peers, that you're sort of, we're all in this together, we're this team, and we're supposed to foster this camaraderie. But it's so true, the points you bring up about sort of just the distance and sort of they're French versus, and I even just in this conversation, my Spanish team, those are the Spanish people, they're not just my teammates, they're our Spanish teammates, and so I mean, it's really interesting. I think I'm a little fascinated by psychology anyway, because this stuff always piques my interest. This, sort of, you would have to be pretty darn introspective to land on that kind of thing just on your own. You know what I mean? Like you wouldn't necessarily even think of it. You would be like, oh, okay, well, of course they're our Spanish team because they're in Spain. But, but it's interesting. You just don't think about it.
Yeah, I didn't think about this so strongly either. Of course, I saw the us versus them in my work so I'm working with clients but I couldn't put my fingers on it. But until I did the research and, the academic research. So I looked at a lot of different papers. And when I came across this one, it was such an aha moment. And when I discuss this and share these ideas with different clients, multinationals and people who are working virtually, so many people can resonate with it. So it's not just we want to think about our Spanish team, but we want to know Raul, Maria, we want to know the people as individuals. And that's the level we need to get at. So we need to get beyond this abstract, but put in a lot of energy to start to get to know them as the individuals that they are.
Yeah, no, I think that is so spot on. And it really is, I guess, if you go back and you sort of look at the laundry list of complaints of remote workers, I mean, there's so many things that are tied to understanding or communication or things like this. And it seems like something like this topic of us versus them, or this, this way of our mind handling distance, could really be at the core of so many of these problems. That basic understanding that I'm speaking to my Spanish teammate, not Anna. Just that little tiny nuanced difference could make all the difference in the world in the way she feels, or that I communicate to her in the way she feels about it. And so I think that's really great. So maybe this is a good point to sort of segue into sort of the, how do we know there's even a problem? So, understanding cultural competency, I think we've covered that. And I think it's pretty clear, what is, cultural competence and how to recognize maybe some of these issues. But if in your position or in your role as somebody who helps guide, multinational teams through some of these problems, I guess assessment must be a piece of this. Can you talk a little bit about how you might look at a distributed team and sort of identify the problems or how well it's functioning or not?
Oh, good question. So when I was looking at all this research and also, comparing it with my own experience as well, I felt that I was just getting the little bit of the parts. So there's so much out there to understand, but I needed something to bring it all together. And in order to do that, I created the CALDO model. So the word CALDO doesn't mean anything for me, at least, but it just is a title of the model. And the model sort of it's a map. And like any map, it has my point of view. So for instance, if you look at a map of the world from a US point of view, the US is in the center. If you look at a map from the Chinese point of view, China is in the center. And so my map, my model, has what I think are very important in the center, which is understanding cultural diversity and understanding how distance impacts us psychologically, and even some other context elements, for instance, like configuration. So the way this model, I've thought about this model is that I have culture, as I said, cultural and technology and distance in the center, distance, therefore technology. I have another thing which I call attitudes. And attitudes are the beliefs and the feelings that team members have towards the team and towards each other. So these are things like trust, psychological safety, shared team identity, feelings of belonging. Some people might call these the soft elements, but they have such a huge impact on the team, not directly towards performance, but through the team and how the team works together. They can greatly impact performance. Another part of the model is this idea called levers. And the levers are the things that people can do, that teams and team leaders can do in the virtual context in order to have an impact, given that we have cultural diversity and we have this distance. And then the other element of the model is the quality of the team leader and the qualities of the team members. So the reason I tell you all that is to get back to your question, which is how does one use this? Well, I use this as a diagnostic tool when I'm looking at teams. So I look at all of these elements. But one that I look at quite strongly is this one called attitudes. Is there trust in the team? Do people feel psychologically safe in order to be able to give their opinion? Do they feel like they belong to the team? And that's a tough one when you're working virtually because there's so many other things that you belong to. There's so many local distractions. But do I feel like this team is important to me? And do I feel valued as an individual, unique person, but also that I feel like I belong to something greater than myself as well?
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. And it's interesting, or maybe purposeful or not, the caldo thing. So in Spanish, caldo is broth, right? And so if you think about it that way, though, it's sort of like, what do you put in a broth? A collection of things, right? And so each of these elements of this caldo model, I think, could sort of be considered the ingredients of a soup, right? If we're trying to make this metaphor that will stick with everybody.
Yeah, I looked into that as well.
Well, it's funny, like even on our end, we have a thing we call the BREAD method, which is basically just this, using the acronym BREAD as a methodology for developing interpersonal relationships and business relationships. And so it's interesting. For some reason, when you tie it to food, people love it. But I do think that it's really interesting. And I think that sort of understanding and leveraging all these cultural dynamics within the team and understanding the attitudes, back to sort of the issues that
come up when people are making complaints about remote work, so much of it has to do with trust and the way that you feel, and these are the intangible things, they're not the stuff that we can measure easily, but they're maybe the most critical components of this. And so I wonder how you sort of look at those. And then if you're, trying to help someone solve problems in those spaces, like, how do you help your clients improve in these kinds of situations?
Yeah. So, for instance, if there's a trust issue, first I would look at the configuration of the team. How is the team set up? Where is everybody? Because that already can give some issues on its own. So, for instance, are there minority-majority groupings in the team? Are there certain places where the team leader is and therefore is not in the others? Or perhaps there are people located at the headquarters. So I look at the configuration because this can have an impact on how the team operates together, how they interact with each other, which can then feed into trust. Another element, of course, is that different cultures build trust differently. Some people need to spend time together, even virtually, to get to know each other, to understand each other, because I'm not just working with an email, I'm really working with a person, and I'd like to know who that person is, and therefore I can build trust. On the other side, some cultures say, well, I'm working with somebody with competence, and therefore that's how I can build trust. So we have different ways of doing that as well. And then in the virtual space, of course, it makes it difficult to just go out to lunch and get to know each other, or that our kids go to the same school. That doesn't happen in the virtual space. And so interestingly, we have this concept called swift trust. So what they're showing in some of the research is that people arrive ready to trust. And that's why you can have very short-term projects and be successful, is because that swift trust is still remaining. But swift trust is, as its name says, very short. And therefore, it has to be replaced by real trust. Now, going back to my scenario, let's say you have the Spanish and the Utah teams, Spanish and American teams working. If I gave you a task, you'd say, let's just give it to the Spanish team, or let's just give it to the American team. Efficiency, logic, okay. But actually, if you want to build trust in your team, you might want to consider having one Spanish person and having one American working on that task together, even though technically and in the collaboration, there's collaboration costs because there's time zones, technology, and all that. But it's through working together that we start to build trust on a team, because we get to show each other that we are reliable. But it's also through those conversations that we start to get to know each other as people as well. So I would start to really look how the team is interacting towards building trust, whether they're really putting energy into that, and how the team interacts and collaborates together.
Yeah, I think there really is something to sort of that mutual accountability, when you're sort of both on the line for something, and just in the world of remote, if you can be doing this with two teams who are, disparate from one another, I think it's a really great opportunity to sort of, I guess, almost force trust. Like, I have to rely on you because we got to get this done.
Well, yeah, we start to learn that each other is reliable, but we also start to have conversations through working together to know each other as people. So it's a double win.
So one configuration you mentioned in your book, I think, unless I'm slaughtering this, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's really interesting, and I've actually heard of similar things elsewhere, is this idea that one configuration that can be successful is when when your isolated person is a team leader or somebody critical to the success of the team. So perhaps you have a sort of co-located team, maybe you have 3 or 4 people in an office in Amsterdam, but your manager is in France or something, or maybe further away even. But I think that there might be something to that configuration. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, configuration is pretty important. In my book, I do spend some time looking at the different configurations and the challenges and advantages. And you're pulling out one of them, which is, you're right, it is kind of interesting. So often we think that if a team has an isolate, so one person on their own, actually it's pretty challenging for that one person to get engaged. People ignore them, or they have a hard time getting their voice heard. And that's true, except if that one person is the team leader or somebody really critical for the team. And if that person is one of those two, then it forces the rest of the team to develop processes of communication to be more consequent on certain disciplines and things like that. It was really interesting because, I heard this and I read it and I thought, oh, and I actually came across it in one of my clients. I was interviewing a gentleman named Tony, who is an isolate manager. Before that, though, he was part of a virtual team where it was much more mixed. And now he came into a situation where he was the isolate and the rest of the team was located. He was located in Denmark and the rest of the team is in Poland. He was nervous. He was wondering how this was going to work. But he found, in fact, that it worked very well because they became very self-sufficient. They were taking care of things and dealing with issues that if they were together, they would have gone to him. But they took on and developed themselves so that they ended up just coming to him for strategic issues or real problems or things where they needed stakeholder support. And he found that to be he was surprised how well that worked, even though at first you would say, uh-oh. So it was really interesting.
And it's interesting because as you were describing it, so my initial thought, around the subject is that, by having somebody remote or having a manager or a stakeholder in a remote position versus the rest of the team, in my head immediately it was this idea of sort of the, accountability thing again. This idea that, well, we're accountable to this guy, so we have to make the extra effort to be accountable to the remote guy. And that was sort of where my logical brain went. But now hearing what you're describing, this idea that they were actually empowered to move forward and do more with their work and maybe, go to levels where they weren't looking so much for approval day to day, ultimately, and maybe big decisions and stuff like that, but sort of the day-to-day operations, they were able to keep things moving and really only ping him, when needed versus, walking down the hall and just knocking on his door for every decision. I think that's a really interesting insight.
It's really interesting. And in fact, I've noticed more and more that type of realization in my multinational clients over time. So I would never have heard that, let's say 7 years ago. 7 years ago, people never listed that as an advantage of working virtually. But now if I say, what are the advantages of working virtually? I hear that more and more, that people notice the development opportunities when their team leader is in a different location because they take on more responsibility. They feel there's someone there to support them for sure. So that's critical as well. But they feel like, okay, I'll do it then. And they take the risk and they learn from it and they get the feedback and they see themselves developing more. So it's really interesting how that's happening.
Yeah, well, and I think it's kind of ultimately what any employer actually wants, right? I mean, they want their people to be empowered and they want people to step up and they don't want to, have to bother the manager with every single decision and that kind of stuff. I mean, ultimately it's what they want. But in a sort of a co-located or a more traditional working environment, it'd be sure easy to just walk down the hall and tap on the guy in the corner of the office and say, hey, buddy, we've got this choice to make, where maybe some of it's just practicality. Like it takes a little extra work to engage this guy remotely. So let's just do it. And then, send it to him for approval or whatever. But, let's as a team that's maybe working together or maybe not, let's work together and then we'll pass this off to our boss. But maybe it's almost a little bit of a practical thing. It's just, it's extra work to engage the boss.
Well, we also have to remember it takes a certain type of leadership to be able to handle this well. Because if you're a very directive leader who's one that needs to be on top of everything, you're going to struggle more in this virtual space. You're going to burn out because you can't be everywhere all the time. So we're not just saying that people are empowered. We need a leadership that realizes I need to have a different type of role. And that role is no longer all day-to-day decision maker, but one of support, coaching. How can I help my team to be their best, even though I'm from a distance? And that I find also very interesting.
Well, so maybe that's a nice segue into sort of this idea of doing a little bit of screening and trying to decide who's actually cut out for this kind of work and understanding what bits, are critical for your particular job. You just gave an example of how it might work for a manager. They need to sort of understand their change in role versus the day-to-day whipcracker. Now maybe they're standing back and allowing the team a little bit more liberty to do their work. But I think, one of the things I see anyway is that so many people who start nose down, especially in this like remote work space, there's this assumption that everybody could do it. Like this is for everyone. And I think that part of this cultural understanding component, to tie it back to sort of the theme of this show, is that not everybody is cut out for remote work, and it's not culture based on where you live or what country you were born in necessarily, but there are different characteristics of people and the way they work and the way they interact with people and so on that make them either great for remote work or not great for remote work. And so I wonder if you have any thoughts or insights on sort of that, bit as it pertains to a successful remote experience.
So where I am right now regarding supporting organizations, supporting people and teams to develop remotely, I'm still on the fence. I'm still on the side of saying just about everybody can develop. I think I have more of a growth mindset than a fixed mindset regarding this. And I think part of the reason that I'm writing the book is I think there's a lot of lack of knowledge, lack of understanding out there right now. I think if people understood what it really means to work virtually with colleagues who are from a different culture and sitting in a different location, if they understood it more, they would make different decisions, they would engage differently, they would develop themselves differently. And I think as well, organizations would support the development of their people differently. So I think we're still in the beginning stages of this remote work and virtual work. And I'm glad to hopefully contribute towards sort of the development of the understanding of what it really means. So I'm not quite ready to give a judgment call on that yet.
Well, no, and I think it's okay. Just even in hearing you that, I kind of want to amend my thought to say, it's not that people aren't capable of learning it. I mean, obviously that growth mindset and that ability to learn skills. I mean, just about anybody can learn just about anything. I guess I was leaning more towards people who might be sort of, I don't know, whether it's genetics or environmentally inclined to do this kind of work. So because those people might be a little more culturally competent to begin with and that sort of thing.
So there are for sure people who are more culturally competent than others, for sure. And that comes a lot through experience, reflection, coaching, courses, just an interest, curiosity. So I think one of the greatest things that somebody who works on a virtual team can do is to actively learn about the cultures of their colleagues. Read a book about the other country, watch some movies on the country, just get a feel. Because like I said in the beginning, I think this is not easy. And one of the reasons it's not easy is I, sitting in my desk, have to learn about my colleague sitting in another country, and I don't get a chance to go there. And so it takes extra effort to find out what it's like for her or him to live there. And part of that is listening to her or him. But part of it is also on my own learning about the other countries.
Yeah, well, and I think it's something that, for people who've listened to the other episodes in this podcast or have read any of my writing, one of the things that I spend a lot of time on is this idea of intention, right? And I think so many of our problems, in the remote workspace and honestly just sort of in life and in relationships and everything is so much to do with having the right intentions or putting energy into things, right? So as you're mentioning, to overcome us versus them or to overcome sort of minority culture and things like this, like so much of it is about just putting in that little bit of extra effort, not coasting through all these relationships or coasting through your job. Rather, you're actively taking a part in it. And I think that that's kind of the point you're making is that, all this stuff can be made better by putting more effort into it.
Yeah, I agree with you, Brian. I agree with you very much. And I think that this is why I'm sort of banging the horn banging the bell around cultural diversity and developing cultural competences, because I think it needs to be included in all of those things that we're learning regarding working virtually and having the intention to develop to be able to do that well.
Yeah, I totally agree. So we're starting to get sort of near the end of this, but there's one topic I really wanted to squeeze in before we wind down here. And it's one of the things that I pulled from your what will eventually be your book. And I can't wait for everybody to get a hold of it. I mean, I just read a little excerpt. Thank you. But that little bit that I read was so impactful. There's some really great information in there. And so I can't wait to see the whole thing.
Thank you.
But one of the ideas that you talk about, and again, maybe this comes back to assessment or just sort of understanding global virtual teams, is you sort of describe that they fall into these three different categories. And you call them destroyers, equalizers, and creators. And I think this goes back to organization and the way that teams are built and the type of work they do and all these things. But it's kind of a complex topic. And I wondered if maybe you would sort of explain that a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. So it is a complex topic, and it's not mine. And I'm sorry, I forgot the names of the professors where this is coming from, but they, we can put that in the show notes maybe.
Sure.
But there are two professors who looked at a variety of different teams, multicultural virtual teams, and they realized that they could put them in three different categories, as you mentioned. So the first one is destroyer. These are teams that are just losing value. Bringing them together was, let's say, a bad idea. They have conflict. They're not able to achieve any of their goals. They really have the us versus them that we talked about earlier. Then the next group is what we call equalizers. And that's an interesting title, but the reason they use that is because these are teams that are basically muting any cultural differences. So the idea is to say we have cultural team norms. This is how we all behave, even though from a cultural point of view, some of the team members may not really align with that. We are just trying to all be the same. Our meetings are fine. We don't have much conflict. We're just getting by. Everything's good. And then the last group are ones that they called creators. These are teams that recognize the cultural diversity, celebrate it, bringing out, talk about it. So if somebody's coming from the US, they say, well, tell us what it's like to communicate in the US to your clients. And then someone from China would say, tell us what it's like to communicate to your clients in China. And then sort of understand that and think about, well, how can we apply that to this situation? So they're leveraging the diversity that's in the team and not trying to just shut it down like the equalizer team did. And that's, I think, quite interesting to look at for a team leader and for a team to say, how are we really going about doing this? Because I think these equalizer teams are quite common. That's what they found, that they're quite common. And what's interesting about these is that most management look at equalizer teams and say, oh, they have so much potential, and yet they're just delivering this. And that's the difference between the equalizers and the creators. The creators deliver higher performance. They are able to leverage all those different ideas in a much better way.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. And I think in your mind, does this go back to sort of team configuration and making sure you've got the right people in the right spot and, making sure that people are located as they should be? And I mean, ultimately, I guess the cultural understandings that exist within the team are a big part of this. I mean, have you discovered anything in your search or in your learning that sort of, I guess, the recipe that makes any particular team?
Well, I think that's the whole book, actually. So it's not just one thing. It's really, and in fact, it's not a particular configuration. It's just understanding how configuration impacts us so that we can have behaviors and ways of being in the team that leverage it instead of getting strangled by it. All team members develop cultural competence, and the team, as a team, develop the cultural competence. So it's a continuous topic. They practice perspective taking, not just thinking about what other people are thinking, but really asking them, what do you think about this situation? So that we start to have what we call task conflict, but actually discussions on different ways of being. And one thing that's really important, if I may, they don't have process conflict. So what we see often in multicultural virtual teams is that in the beginning, high performance teams talk about how they are going to work together. So they create a team charter. Because let's face it, someone coming from Spain, someone coming from the US or the Netherlands, we have different ways of working, but we assume that everyone else has the same way of working. And this turns into conflict later down the road, different expectations. So if we talk very early, how are we going to work together? And then be ready to adjust along the way as we find out what the reality is of our team. Then we're respecting these different ways, and it doesn't turn out to be a really detrimental conflict later.
Yeah, no.
Does that make sense? Because I bounced around a little. Okay.
Yeah, no, I mean, it makes perfect sense to me. And I think that, it's interesting as we talk about all these different topics, how they really do all revolve around the same core set of things, and we've really got to extrapolate all these ideas and learn and develop skills and competencies around all these different things to solve the problems. But at the end of the day, it really does have to do with this cultural understanding.
That's my view. So as I told you, the map I look at, culture is quite important, and as well as how to work virtually.
Well, so speaking of just all the research you've been doing, you've got this book coming out in the near term. Can you talk about, I mean, have you had any like major insights or big, you mentioned an aha moment earlier, like have you had some big things that have come out of your research that just made you rethink the way you thought about this stuff, or maybe totally affirmed what you thought?
Well, I think we've covered a lot of it actually. So how culture impacts teams was quite impressive for me. Looking at some of the different research and going more deeply into just that we have cultural differences to really understand that. Also, as we mentioned, this how distance impacts us. I think it's also interesting, just to close off, this whole idea of sort of a collaboration equation. I'm still sort of playing with this, but so we think collaboration, in order to collaborate on a virtual teams, is quite costly, right? We have time zone differences, we have to use technology. So it's much easier than to have people working who are side by side working together. But we don't put into that equation the positives of having people working across different sites together, especially if we're thinking about the long-term sustainability of the team. And I think that's kind of interesting to start to think about those, not just the costs of collaboration, but the benefits of collaboration as well, and sort of putting that into an equation. That's what I'm playing with right now.
No, I think that's amazing. I mean, there are so many people, companies and all these people that are really looking for ways to, I guess, sort of rationalize the idea of remote work, or, and so much credence is paid to like ROI and things like that. And, I think the more that we can develop tools and resources that allow people to, quantify how this is working in the grander scheme of their business or in their corporation or, whatever it is they're doing. I think it's really valuable to try and develop those things, because I see so much stuff, that people just throw out and kind of just say words that sound buzzy and cool, and it must mean something. And you sort of understand it at this really high level, the two words they've put together or whatever it is. But the deeper understanding is just missing. And I think breaking it into something actionable, like an equation, would be really, could be really impactful.
Great. Yeah.
So, well, cool. So Theresa, just to sort of wind down, let's, where can people learn more about you? If you'd like to plug your book or sort of talk about what's coming, that would be awesome. And then just let people know where they can find you and learn more about the work you're doing.
Thanks, Ryan. Well, they can find me on LinkedIn for sure. I also have a website, interact-global.net. So you're absolutely welcome to that. And if you go there, you can also sign up for the newsletter. So I don't spam you and put lots of information daily, not at all. It's something like once a month or once every 2 months. And that's also a way to keep up to date on the book as well.
Awesome. Well, cool. Well, we're sure looking forward to it. I am specifically looking forward to the book, so I can't wait to see it. Thanks so much for joining us here. I can't wait for people to hear this stuff, and hopefully, this will help build better teams.
Well, thank you, Ryan. It's been really a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Oh, you anything? I don't know you anything.